Second line of defense of our innate immune system include what we call microbial substances. Those are proteins and other molecules that work together. We're going to talk about interferons a little bit, what's called the complement system, iron binding proteins, and antimicrobial proteins are all substances, molecules in the body. What I like to do is focus more on the interferons and complement. So we'll take a close look at those two. We also have some cells that are available. We have phagocytes. We also have some cells called natural killer cells. But those are cells, immune cells that are part of your innate system. We have the ability to produce inflammation, which is a way to destroy microbes if they've gotten in and to prevent their spread and to help us repair tissue. And then fever. Fever helps to intensify our immune system, helps to reduce the ability of microbial growth, and to speed up repair. So let's look at interferons. This picture I don't believe is in your textbook. I found it from a microbiology book. And this is going to help us visualize what interferons do. So what we have is a virus. So if you haven't taken microbiology, a virus is an acellular pathogen. So it's not made up of cells. So some believe that a virus is not actually a living organism. And it's not, because the virus cannot replicate on its own. And one definition of living is you have to be acellular and you have to be able to reproduce. And this virus cannot. The only way it can is to infect a cell. So this is one of your cells. It's a host cell. It could be a cell of your respiratory tract. And let's say this is the flu. And when this flu virus gets into a cell, it has the ability to hijack that cell and use your cell's machinery, like ribosomes and other enzymes, to reproduce. And that cell is a goner. That cell is either going to die from the virus, or our immune system is going to destroy this cell using T cells. But interferons are a way to protect the neighboring cells, the nearby cells. So you'll notice while this cell is infected and this virus is reproducing, the cell initiates transcription and translation of a gene that results in the production of interferon proteins. These interferon proteins are going to be released from the cell. They're going to go to the neighboring cell and initiate the production of what's known as antiviral proteins. These antiviral proteins can block replication of that virus. So interferon's the job of an interferon, is to warn and protect neighboring cells. My analogy is if your car got broken into, one of the things a good neighbor is going to do is go tell your neighbors that your car got broken into last night. It might be a good idea to start locking our cars. And that protects your neighbor's cars. Now, your car already got broken into, but you can still do something about it. You can protect your neighbors. So that's what interferons do. An interferon comes from interfering. So it results in interfering with that virus. Most important to understand is this helps protect from viruses. It doesn't do much to protect you from bacteria. And once we learned this, by the way, we can manufacture interferon. And we use it as a therapy now. Certain viral infections, we can give individuals interferon. An example would be hepatitis. If someone has hepatitis, which is a viral infection of the liver, we can give interferon to protect the liver cells that are not infected with the virus. Next one is complement. Complement's very complicated. You'll notice that involves a lot of proteins that all have the designation C for complement. We're not going to go crazy and learn all these C proteins. We want to look at the big picture. And the big picture is complement is a series of proteins that help you deal with bacteria. So that's a big difference between interferons and complement. Complement's a lot more useful when we're dealing with a bacterial infection. And complement ultimately helps you do three things. Number one, it helps with phagocytosis. It enhances the phagocytosis of microbes. So these proteins, the complement proteins, will attach to a microbe and tag it. We call that process opsonization. Opsonization is attaching a protein to a microbe, which kind of red flags it. It tags that microbe for phagocytosis. So this macrophage, or this phagocyte here, really hones in on a microbe when it has complement proteins attached to it. So that's known as opsonization. Next function is it helps initiate inflammation. So we'll talk more about inflammation coming up, but it helps stimulate the process of inflammation. And then the third function is it actually forms a pore in the membrane of a microbe. So this is the bacteria's plasma membrane. And these complement proteins all arrange together. They complement one another and form what's known as the membrane attack complex. Basically, that's a pore or a big giant hole that's formed in the membrane, and it causes lysis of the cell. All right? The cell breaks open and the microbe dies. So three important functions of complement: opsonization, inflammation, and cytolysis, breaking open a cell. Another second line of defense are your phagocytes. So the most common phagocytes we're going to be talking about are the macrophages, but neutrophils, and there's another cell type called dendritic cells. Dendritic means tree-like. It has kind of branches extending from it. But we've all heard of phagocytosis by this point. It's an ability to identify a microbe. Usually that microbe has been opsonized. It has things attached to it, either complement or antibodies. It initiates an endocytosis, right? Brings in that microbe into a vesicle called a phagosome. That phagosome merges with a lysosome because a lysosome has digestive enzymes that can digest and destroy that microbe. Now, what's very interesting that we're going to get to in the adaptive system is this cell will actually present little pieces of that microbe to the immune system. It'll basically grab a little piece of that microbe and show it to your lymphocytes and say, hey, look what I just found. I phagocytosed this. We don't need to worry about this one, but there's a good chance if there's one microbe that I just phagocytosed, there's going to be more. So we need to ramp up our immune response and go find them. So that's a really cool part of the immune system, is to be able to warn other immune cells. Inflammation. Inflammation is a very important second line of defense. There's good inflammation and there's bad inflammation. Good inflammation is more the acute inflammation, the rapid onset, and then it kind of goes away. And then there's bad inflammation. Bad inflammation is the chronic inflammation, the inflammation that can slowly present itself and make all other pathologies even worse. Chronic inflammation makes autoimmune diseases worse. It makes cancer worse. It makes a lot of things worse when there's inflammation involved. One really bad form of chronic inflammation is emphysema. Emphysema is when there's long-term inflammation in the lungs that lead to destruction of the lung tissue. So emphysema is actually your own immune responses destroying your lung tissue because the presence of inflammation over years and years. But the clinical signs of inflammation is red hot swelling and pain. Red and hot is because of the increased blood flow to the tissue. So typically the initiation of inflammation is tissue injury, and that tissue injury is going to cause the production of pro-inflammatory chemicals that promote vasodilation and increased permeability of blood vessels. What that does is it brings in more blood to the area, which makes that tissue red and hot. The increased permeability causes more filtration of fluid from the blood vessels, therefore the tissue swells. And a lot of these chemicals activate your nociceptors, which are your pain-sensitive neurons. So we have increased blood flow to the area and emigration of immune cells. So these cells are what we call emigrating. They are leaving the blood and getting to the scene and phagocytosing those microbes. So this looks to me like a monocyte and a macrophage. This looks like a neutrophil. What are some of the pro-inflammatory molecules? Histamine, very potent vasodilator, and it increases permeability. We've heard of antihistamines like Benadryl. Histamine causes a lot of that inflammation we see with allergic reactions. There are some other ones that you don't hear too much about. Prostaglandins and leukotrienes. These are very similar in that they intensify inflammation. This is a more complicated area of pro-inflammatories in that there's a number of different versions of prostaglandins, and different tissues produce different kinds of prostaglandins. Leukotrienes are very common in the respiratory tract. When we get to the respiratory system, we'll see that leukotrienes can cause respiratory inflammation, and we can reduce those to treat respiratory inflammation. But these guys are targets of many of our anti-inflammatory drugs. So in the world of anti-inflammatory, there's a lot of different ways to reduce inflammation. But if you can identify a pro-inflammatory, you can find ways to block it. So corticosteroids like prednisone, hydrocortisone, all kinds of isones are steroids. A steroid is a chemical class. So these are lipids, and they are very powerful anti-inflammatory drugs used for a lot of different reasons: respiratory, joint inflammation, severe allergic reactions. But they can be a little bit dangerous because you produce natural steroids, and if you're taking these, it can disrupt your production of natural steroids. So we have the NSAIDs, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, such as aspirin, ibuprofen, naproxen. These block the production of prostaglandins. So do corticosteroids, they just do it a little differently. But there's a number of enzymes that are involved in the production of prostaglandins. And if you can block those enzymes, you can reduce prostaglandin production. NSAIDs are anti-inflammatory, as the name suggests. They are analgesic, so they can be used to reduce pain. They are antiplatelet. They can be used to reduce the formation of blood clots. And they are antipyretic. They can be used as fever reducers. So NSAIDs are extremely common, used all the time. I'm sure every one of us have taken an NSAID in our life. But they have their downsides. There are a number of prostaglandins that are good for organs. Like your stomach needs prostaglandins to produce the thick mucus lining. Your kidneys need prostaglandins. So if you're taking a lot of NSAIDs, you could be affecting the stomach and you can be harming the kidney. Notice the drug on here that we hear a lot about, is not an NSAID. Tylenol. Tylenol is not a true NSAID. It has no anti-inflammatory property, but it does have analgesic and antipyretic properties. Fever is also a second line of defense. It also is good for you, but could be bad for you. It's good for you in that it boosts your immune responses. It helps proliferation of immune cells, helps them migrate, and it helps them destroy pathogens. So that increased body temperature is very useful to boost your immune system. Usually by the time you know you have a fever, it's done its job. Another added function is to reduce the growth of bacteria and increase tissue repair. There's another number of pyrogens that induce fever. Some of them our body makes. They're endogenous, interleukin 1 and interleukin 6. Some of them are released by bacteria. There's a type of bacterium, a whole bunch of them are called gram-negative bacteria versus gram-positive. But the gram-negative bacteria produce a molecule called LPS, lipopolysaccharide. It's a very toxic substance, and it can induce a fever. So when we have a fever, we can reduce it by giving antipyretic drugs like those NSAIDs as well as Tylenol. And I'll remind you the key area that regulates your body temperature is the hypothalamus. So pyrogens affect your hypothalamus. And your hypothalamus is like a thermostat. It can raise your body temperature. But again, there's good and there's bad. If the fever is extremely high and for a long period of time, it can have negative effects. So those are our innate responses. The next video, we're going to begin the adaptive immune system.